He recorded his confession onto a cassette tape and mailed it to a stranger because he could no longer trust the people he loved to carry the weight of what he knew. The tape sat in a shoebox for 6 years before anyone listened to it. When they finally did, they heard the voice of a 91-year-old man breathing carefully, choosing his words like a man walking across ice. His name, on the tape, is never given in full. He calls himself only the flight surgeon. Military records from the base in question list a redacted name under the same rank, the same unit, the same dates. Whether the two are the same person is something I have spent the better part of 2 years trying to confirm. I have not fully succeeded. But I have found enough to make me believe that somebody who wore that uniform saw something in the summer of 1947 that he was never able to put down. He explains early in the recording why he waited so long. Not fear of ridicule, fear of a phone call. He says that twice in his life, men in unmarked cars visited relatives of soldiers who had spoken too freely, and that both times those soldiers grew quiet again very quickly. He never says what the men in the cars said. He only says that the message was understood. The interviewer who received the tape was not a journalist. She was a hospice volunteer who had spent afternoons with him in his final year, listening to stories she assumed were simply the wandering memories of an old man. It was only after his death that a nephew found the recording equipment, along with a note asking that the tape be sent to her and no one else. She kept it private for years. When she finally shared portions of it with a small archive dedicated to preserving oral histories of the era, she added a note of her own. I do not know if what he told me is true. I know that he believed it, and that belief cost him something he never got back. That is where this story begins, not with a crash, with a man trying to unburden himself before it was too late to matter. He says he was brought to the examination room shortly after 2 in the morning. He remembers the temperature first because the building's cooling system had been pushed far below anything he considered normal, and he assumed, correctly it turned out, that someone above his rank had ordered it that way. The air smelled faintly metallic, he says, a smell he associates to this day with the inside of a dentist's drill. 2 enlisted men stood at the door without speaking. A senior officer he had never met before that night gave him a folder, told him almost nothing, and instructed him to observe only and to write down what he saw exactly as he saw it, with no interpretation. He remembers the sound of his own footsteps on the tile. He remembers a single overhead light positioned directly above a table, and how everything outside that circle of light seemed to fall into shadow, so that the room felt smaller than it was. He remembers his hands were cold before he ever touched anything, and that his pen, when he finally tried to use it, would not write properly in that temperature, so someone brought him a pencil instead. And then he describes what was on the table. He is careful here. He never once on the entire tape uses the word alien. He calls it throughout the patient, a habit he says came from 30 years of training that never quite left him, even in a moment like that one. He describes the skin first, saying it did not look like skin so much as behave like skin, moving and settling in ways that made him think of something recently submerged in water. He describes the proportions of the limbs as wrong in a way he struggled to define even decades later, saying only that his eyes kept trying to correct what they were seeing, the way they do with an optical illusion, and kept failing. He pauses on the tape for nearly 11 seconds before describing the eyes. When he finally does, his voice changes. He says they were closed, and that this was, in a strange way, the most unsettling detail of the entire night, because closed eyes on something so unfamiliar felt like an invitation he was not prepared to accept. He noted a faint rise and fall at what he assumed was the chest. He noted it, then dismissed it, then noted it again 40 minutes later. He describes checking his own pulse against a wall clock, convinced he was imagining things in the cold and the bad light. The official report, he says, listed the patient as deceased upon arrival. He disagreed with that conclusion from nearly the first hour, And he says he told the senior officer as much and was told to finish his notes and keep his opinions to himself. The more I investigated, the stranger the paperwork became. A hospital administrative ledger from the region, partially declassified in the 1990s, lists an unusual overnight requisition of medical supplies for that base during the same week, including quantities of preservation fluid that seem excessive for the personnel stationed there. The ledger offers no explanation. The line item simply exists, unexplained, surrounded by ordinary entries for aspirin and bandages, as if someone wanted it buried in the mundane. He describes the moment everything changed near the end of his shift, close to dawn. The room had gone quiet, the other men had stepped out to change shifts, and for perhaps 90 seconds, he says, he was alone with the patient for the first time all night. He says he had leaned in to check the position of the head, and that is when it happened. The eye on the left side opened. Not suddenly, he insists. Slowly, the way a person opens their eyes from a very deep sleep, unsure at first whether they are truly awake. He says the room did not move. He did not move. He describes his own heartbeat as the loudest sound he has ever heard in his life, a physical thing pressing against his ribs. He says he counted 3 full breaths before he trusted himself to breathe at all. The eye, he says, found him, not scanned the room, found him specifically and held there. He describes no colour, no shape he can put into words even now, only the unbearable sensation of being observed by something that understood, with complete clarity, that it was being watched in return. He does not know how long that lasted. He guesses 10 seconds. He admits it might have been 3. Then the eye closed again and the room returned to what it had been, except that nothing about him ever fully did. He never reported that moment, not that night, not in his official notes, not for 40 years. He tells the hospice volunteer it is the only lie of omission he ever told in his professional life, and that he has never stopped regretting it, and never stopped understanding exactly why he told it. Within days, he says, everything from that night was gone. His notes were collected by an officer he never saw again. 2 of the enlisted men from the door were reassigned to postings on opposite coasts within the week. He was told, in a private conversation he describes as brief and unusually gentle, that his career, his pension, and by clear implication his family's safety depended on his silence, and that this conversation itself had never taken place. I have tried to locate the 2 enlisted men, or their descendants. One trail ends in a house fire in the 1970s that destroyed a family's private papers. The other simply ends, the way so many of these trails do, in a name too common to trace with any confidence.